And first off, I'm going to ask Tony Staunton, if Tony can come along. So Tony is a vice chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He's also a very active trade unionist, and he's based down in Plymouth, in Devonport, where the British government maintain Britain's nuclear submarines. So he's here to talk about his solidarity here today, but also the really vital work that he's doing down there, another nuclear base that needs closing down.
Thanks very much, and solidarity to everybody here and around the country. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament has spent this year touring the bases, the nuclear bases, to identify and expose what's going on. And I will just say about Plymouth that the private company, Babcock International, is now getting £4.5 billion of taxpayers' money into funding a refit and an upgrade of the nuclear dockyard for the next generation of nuclear submarines and the next generation of nuclear weapons. And as part of that, that is Starmer's rearmament programme. It's part of the £13 billion a year now going into nuclear weapons in Britain. £13 billion of taxpayers' money. And what we know all the time is the extent and degree of poverty, the low wage economy that we have, the high unemployment, and the immiserisation of both our younger generation and our elderly generation. The poor housing, the destruction of the National Health Service, that's what's happening. And we have to call this out. We have to make the links. We have to put the two things together. £13 billion on illegal weapons of mass destruction, while we're seeing our social infrastructure crumbling. But you know, the rearmament is the argument in its own, and we need to argue against it, and therefore we have to challenge government. But there's another element to it too, because in this, Plymouth is very poor. Everybody who goes to any of the nuclear bases will know that all the technocrats, all the people with nuclear science understanding, all the good jobs, they live outside the cities. So Plymouth is a very poor city, because anybody who works there can afford to live outside it, and the money doesn't stay in the city. What they're doing now is not simply rearmament, but they're doing remilitarization and the militarization of society, which means that Babcock and the council, the Labour Council, are in league now to bring the workers, the ordinary workers, from the dockyard, which is on the west side of the city, into the city centre, building new housing, but actually to make sure that Babcock dominates the centre of the city. And Babcock already dominates the city. If you go to the hospital, half of the nurses and doctors you will see are military. Babcock's insignia are everywhere around our major regional hospital. If you go to the university, Babcock gives the funding for a wide range of environmental, and nuclear radiation research laboratories, so that Babcock dominates our higher education and further education in the city. And that is part of what's the militarisation. But you know, Starmer's Strategic Defence Review actually also has put money aside to educate. And that means that we see the military and Babcock going into our primary schools as well as secondary schools in uniforms, telling people how great and fit it is to be militaristic. So all this goes together. All this goes together to say, for CND, the fight against nuclear weapons is also the fight for welfare. Welfare, not warfare, is a major slogan. And then we come to Lakenheath. And Lakenheath is an American base. It's the first time I've been on there, thanks to the London coach, which inadvertently drove in onto American soil. I wanted to get out and run about and probably break windows, but I wasn't allowed. The reality is that Trump, as the President of the United States, is absolutely for the rebuilding and the renewal of nuclear weaponry, and for the use. Remember, NATO is first strike, Americans' policy is first strike only. We carry on like that. But people need to understand that Trump is moving away from democracy and into authoritarian dictatorship. Do not be fooled. 1 month ago, Trump took the 4 highest directors of the 4 leading technology companies, all looking at AI, and put 4 of the leading directors into the military, made them lieutenant colonels with the power from the corporation to be able to instruct generals on both what they're going to fund and their military strategy. That is the bringing together, the melding of the corporations with the state. That is the end of democracy, by the way. That is a part of the economic definition of fascism. And we need to be honest about that. Trump is also now threatening senior judges with jail. He can just order someone to jail if they stand against him, if they judge against him. That is the end of the separation of the legislature and the courts. That's another definition of fascism. And I think we also have to say that in this country, when we saw at least 150,000 people following the fascist Tommy Robinson into the centre of London last weekend, a sea change. We've never seen a fascist-led demonstration of 150,000 in the history of Britain. When we see that funded by Musk, who has Sieg Heiled, and who on the big screen that he funded in Whitehall said it is time to end Parliament and that you have to fight for your free speech and rights. And these two things together actually mean that American fascist organizations and the president and his people are funding the end of democracy in Britain. So that's the third element. We have to fight for democracy and we have to fight against fascism. CND supports Stand Up to Racism. We were on the demonstration, we were kettled, it was fun last weekend, and we need to build the fight against militarism, against rearmament, against racism, against the nationalism that actually breeds war, and against fascism. Thank you very much.